Top 10 Historical Disputes that Caused the Falklands War. The sudden, sharp conflict of the 1982 Falklands War seemed to erupt out of nowhere for many observers, a 10-week burst of intense fighting over a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic. Yet, this war was no sudden storm. It was the culmination of centuries of simmering resentments, conflicting claims, and diplomatic failures. The roots of the conflict are a tangled web of exploration, colonialism, national pride, and economic desperation. To understand why two nations would go to war over these windswept islands, known as the Falklands to the British and the Malvinas to the Argentines, we must journey back through time. The dispute is a classic case study in how historical grievances, when left unresolved, can fester and ultimately explode. From the first tentative sightings by European sailors to the desperate political gambles of the 20th century, a series of key moments and long-standing arguments set the stage for war. Here are the top 10 historical disputes that led to the Falklands War. 1. A murky discovery. The competing claims of first sighting. Every territorial dispute begins with a simple question: who was here first? In the case of the Falkland Islands, the answer is frustratingly unclear, providing the very first seed of conflict. British history asserts that the islands were first sighted in 1592 by the English explorer John Davis aboard the ship Desire. This claim is enshrined in the island's motto, "Desire the Right." However, this account is not universally accepted. Argentina and other sources point to evidence suggesting that members of Ferdinand Magellan's expedition may have spotted the islands as early as 1520. This ambiguity over the initial discovery is more than a historical footnote. It's the bedrock of the entire sovereignty dispute. For Britain, Davis's sighting forms the basis of their historical claim, an argument of precedence. For Argentina, the possibility of an earlier Spanish-affiliated sighting supports their narrative of a long-standing connection to the region, inherited from the Spanish Empire. Because there was no indigenous population on the islands, the claim of first discovery became the primary justification for ownership. With no definitive, universally accepted proof, both nations were able to construct historical narratives that supported their own right to the islands, creating a fundamental and irreconcilable disagreement from the very beginning. This murky origin story meant the dispute wasn't about interpreting a treaty, but about which nation's version of history was the correct one. 2. The short-lived French and Spanish settlements, a revolving door of control. The 18th century saw the first tangible attempts to settle the islands, and this period only added more layers of complexity to the sovereignty question. In 1764, the French, under Louis de Bougainville, established a settlement at Port Louis on East Falkland. A year later, completely unaware of the French presence, a British expedition led by John Byron arrived at West Falkland and claimed the archipelago for King George III, establishing a settlement at Port Egmont. For a brief period, two rival European powers occupied the islands without the other's knowledge. This precarious situation soon became a major diplomatic incident. Spain, citing rights based on the 15th century Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, protested the French and British presence. France, wanting to avoid conflict with its ally Spain, agreed to sell its settlement to the Spanish in 1767. The Spanish then formally claimed the entire archipelago and, in 1770, sent a large military force to expel the British from Port Egmont, bringing the two nations to the brink of war. While a fragile peace was negotiated that allowed the British to return, they ultimately abandoned their settlement in 1774 for economic reasons, leaving behind a plaque asserting their continued claim. This chaotic period created a precedent of contested control, with claims and counterclaims from three major European powers, leaving a legacy of Spanish administration that Argentina would later inherit. 3. The Argentine inheritance, assuming Spain's mantle in the South Atlantic. The early 19th century was a period of revolutionary change in South America. As the Spanish Empire crumbled, its former colonies declared their independence. In 1816, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, the precursor to modern-day Argentina, declared its independence from Spain. Following a widely accepted principle of international law at the time, uti possidetis juris, meaning as you possess under law, newly independent states would inherit the territories and borders of their former colonial rulers. Based on this principle, Argentina argued that it inherited Spain's sovereign rights to the Malvinas. The Spanish had been the last effective administrators of the islands before the Napoleonic Wars disrupted their empire, and Buenos Aires saw itself as the rightful successor. In 1820, Argentina formally proclaimed its sovereignty over the archipelago. They established a penal colony and appointed Luis Vernet as the island's commander in 1829. Vernet attempted to establish a sustainable, functioning colony, but his efforts to regulate sealing and whaling in the area brought him into direct conflict with American interests. This assertion of inherited sovereignty is the central pillar of the Argentine claim, viewing the subsequent British actions not as a reassertion of a dormant right, but as an invasion of territory that was legally and historically theirs. 4. The USS Lexington incident, an American intervention with lasting consequences. Luis Vernet's attempts to govern the islands and control their rich marine resources led to a pivotal and destructive event. When he seized American sealing ships for violating his regulations, it triggered a disproportionately aggressive response from the United States. In 1831, the American warship USS Lexington, under the command of Captain Silas Duncan, sailed to the Falklands to protect American interests. Duncan's actions were swift and devastating. He declared the Argentine government a nest of pirates, arrested Vernet's deputy, and destroyed the settlement's guns and powder stores. The Lexington incident effectively shattered the burgeoning Argentine colony. Duncan encouraged the settlers to leave, and many did, leaving the settlement in a state of chaos and disarray. This act of military intervention created a power vacuum and significantly weakened Argentina's physical hold on the islands. For Argentina, it was a crippling blow, inflicted by a foreign power that directly paved the way for the British return. The event is often seen in Argentine history as an act of imperialist aggression that undermined their legitimate authority. While the United States was not acting in concert with Britain, its intervention had the undeniable effect of leaving the Falklands vulnerable and undefended, setting the stage for the final act of the early dispute. 5. The British return of 1833, reassertion or invasion. With the Argentine settlement in ruins and its authority in tatters following the USS Lexington raid, Britain saw its opportunity. On January 3, 1833, the British sloop HMS Clio arrived at the islands. Its commander, Captain John Onslow, informed the remaining Argentine commander that he was there to reassert British sovereignty. The small Argentine garrison, vastly outmatched, was expelled without a shot being fired. The British tricolour was replaced with the Union Jack, and this action has remained the single most contentious event in the history of the dispute. From the British perspective, this was not an invasion, but a simple reassertion of the claim they had never relinquished, symbolized by the plaque left at Port Egmont in 1774. They were merely removing an illegal occupation on their sovereign territory. For Argentina, however, the event of 1833 was and remains a traumatic act of imperial aggression, the forceful, illegal seizure of a part of their national territory. They have consistently protested the action through diplomatic channels ever since. This singular event transformed the dispute from a complex historical argument into a clear narrative of foreign occupation for Argentina. It became a powerful symbol of national grievance, a wrong that had to be righted, and the core motivation behind every subsequent attempt to reclaim the islands. 6. A century of unbroken British rule versus persistent Argentine protest. Following the 1833 reassertion, Britain maintained continuous and undisputed control over the Falkland Islands for the next 149 years. They established a stable, permanent settlement, primarily focused on sheep farming, and administered the islands as a British Crown colony. From a British legal standpoint, this long period of peaceful and uninterrupted administration solidified their claim to sovereignty. In international law, the concept of prescription suggests that long-term peaceful possession can strengthen a territorial claim, especially when other claimants do not take forceful action. However, Argentina never let its claim die. While they lacked the military or political power to challenge British control directly for much of this period, they never acquiesced. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Argentina consistently registered its protest through diplomatic channels. In speeches, at international forums like the United Nations, and on official maps, the Malvinas were always depicted as an integral part of Argentina under foreign occupation. This created two parallel and incompatible realities. For Britain and the islanders, the matter was settled history, a fact on the ground. For Argentina, it was an open wound, a continuing dispute where the passage of time did not legitimize the original act of usurpation. This fundamental disagreement on the effect of time, peaceful rule versus persistent protest, ensured the conflict remained unresolved. 7. The United Nations and decolonization, a new stage for the dispute. The post-World War II era saw the rise of the United Nations and a global push towards decolonization. This movement provided Argentina with a powerful new international platform to press its claim. In 1965, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2065, which formally recognized the existence of a sovereignty dispute between the United Kingdom and Argentina over the islands. This was a major diplomatic victory for Argentina. The resolution invited both parties to proceed without delay with the negotiations with a view to finding a peaceful solution to the problem. Crucially, it framed the issue not as a simple case of decolonization, but as a special and particular colonial situation that required a unique solution. The resolution called for the interests of the islanders to be taken into account, but notably, it did not grant them the right to self-determination, which would have heavily favored the pro-British population. Britain engaged in these negotiations, at times even considering a leaseback agreement where sovereignty would be transferred to Argentina with a guarantee of the islanders' way of life. However, the powerful lobbying of the Falkland Islanders, who were vehemently opposed to any transfer of sovereignty, consistently stymied any diplomatic breakthrough. The UN's involvement internationalized the dispute, but ultimately led to a stalemate. 8. The Shackleton Report and economic potential, raising the stakes. For decades, the Falklands were seen as a remote and economically stagnant backwater. However, this perception began to change in the 1970s. In 1976, a comprehensive economic survey, led by Lord Shackleton, was published. The report highlighted the potential for significant economic development on the islands, particularly in areas like deep-sea fishing and, most tantalizingly, the possibility of offshore oil and gas reserves in the surrounding continental shelf. The Shackleton Report suddenly raised the stakes of the sovereignty dispute. The islands were no longer just a symbol of national pride or a relic of empire. They were a potential source of immense natural resource wealth. For Britain, this added a new economic incentive to retain control. For Argentina, the prospect of Britain exploiting these potential resources in what they considered their own territorial waters was intolerable. The potential for oil transformed the dispute from a purely historical and political argument into a vital economic one. This economic dimension added a new layer of urgency and made a negotiated settlement even more difficult, as the future control of valuable resources was now on the table. 9. The Argentine military junta, nationalism as a political weapon. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military junta. This regime, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, was facing a severe domestic crisis. The economy was collapsing, inflation was rampant, and the government's dirty war, a campaign of state terrorism against its own people, had resulted in thousands of disappearances and widespread human rights abuses. The junta's popularity was plummeting, and it was facing massive public discontent. In this desperate political climate, the Malvinas issue presented a tempting opportunity. The junta's leaders believed that a successful military operation to reclaim the islands would be a powerful, unifying force. It would tap into the deep-seated nationalistic sentiment surrounding the Malvinas, distract the public from the economic crisis and human rights atrocities, and restore the prestige of the armed forces. The dispute was no longer just a foreign policy issue, it became a tool for domestic political survival. Galtieri and his colleagues gambled that a quick, decisive victory would generate a massive surge of patriotic fervor that would shore up their crumbling regime. This cynical political calculation was the immediate trigger that transformed the long-simmering historical dispute into an active military conflict. 10. The final miscalculation. Britain's perceived lack of will. The Argentine junta's decision to invade on April 2, 1982, was based on a critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. They believed that the United Kingdom would not or could not fight to retake the islands. There were several reasons for this assessment. Britain was in the midst of its own economic recession and was implementing significant defense cuts. The 1981 British Nationality Act had downgraded the status of Falkland Islanders, which Argentina interpreted as a sign of waning interest. Furthermore, Britain had announced the withdrawal of its only naval patrol ship in the South Atlantic, HMS Endurance. To the Argentine leadership, it appeared that Britain, a distant power seemingly in decline, no longer had the political will or the military capability to mount a major amphibious operation 8,000 miles from home. They expected at most a diplomatic protest at the UN and perhaps some economic sanctions. The determined and swift response of the British government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, came as a complete shock. Thatcher's government viewed the invasion as an unacceptable act of aggression against a sovereign British territory and its people. The junta's misreading of British resolve was the final piece of the puzzle, the spark that ignited the tinderbox of historical grievances and led directly to the outbreak of the Falklands War.